Welcome to Ideological, where we talk about basically whatever we want. I'm here with a good friend of mine, Jeremy Dice, who is an expert on First Amendment law. So when it comes to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, these kind of things, Jeremy, thank you for being on the show.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Before we jump into the content today, I need to mention two disclaimers. We got two disclaimers this time because this is a legal thing. One is the podcast is given for informational purposes only. This is not supposed to be construed as official legal advice, although it's excellent advice. Please talk to your local attorney, lawyer, legal professional before making those decisions. The other disclaimer that I want to mention is by being on the podcast today, neither Jeremy nor the company that he works for, First Liberty, is necessarily endorsing any of the other podcasts I do. Now, they're excellent podcasts, and I think everyone should endorse them, but a retweet does not constitute endorsement, as people used to say before it was called X. So, Jeremy, tell us a little bit about yourself. Jeremy's a humble guy, and so I want you to not be humble here. I want you to tell me a little bit about your background and the group that you work for and what you guys do.
Yeah, well, as you said, I'm an attorney, and I'm an attorney specifically that defends religious liberty. In fact, that's sort of a weird thing, I suppose, but in the 8th grade, I knew I wanted to be an attorney to defend religious freedom. And we can talk about that backstory a little bit, but here I am, many, many years later after that initial thought, being an attorney to defend religious freedom for all Americans. And so what I do every day is get up in the morning and find a new lawsuit to bring against some government actor, probably somewhere around the country, that is being aggressive towards people of faith, that are trying to, in some cases, take their property. Like we defended a synagogue in New York that the city was trying to seize by eminent domain its property to kick them out of the town, or keep pastors out of jail, like I'm currently working on a case as of this morning, as a matter of fact, as well, or just in general trying to make sure people are able to freely exercise their religion wherever that may be. That has taken me from small little district courts around the country to the Supreme Court and every court, it seems like, in between. It's been a great ride, and I specifically work for a group called First Liberty Institute, which is a nationwide legal organization that defends religious liberty for all Americans. We do that by defending religious liberty in our military, within our schools, our houses of worship, within the public square, as well as in the marketplace as well, because we think you should have religious liberty. It should apply in all those areas of your life. And folks can go to firstliberty.org to learn more if they want.
Fantastic. I feel like you make George Washington look like a communist, so I appreciate you standing up for the First Amendment. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Tell me how many times, though, the group that you work with has been to the U.S. Supreme Court, how many times you've won, all that kind of stuff.
We had a span there in about 14 months where we won 4 cases at the Supreme Court of the United States. That was about a year and a half ago where that came down. But I think in our total lifetime, we were 9 for 9 at the Supreme Court of the United States. And that includes argued cases, but also cases that, people don't appreciate, they love the argued cases, right? That gets all the attention. But lawyers really love the written word. And so when we do like the written briefing and persuade judges or justices in this case to overturn a lower court decision without even having to get up there to make an argument orally, it's an even better case. And so you include all those cases when you're talking about going to the Supreme Court and coming back with a win. That doesn't happen very often, that you have that kind of a win.
That's awesome, dude. 9 for 9. Again, I'm no mathematician. I'm no Scientologist, but that's 100% win ratio. So congrats on that. Because you guys do what you do, I have some questions today around the First Amendment, which is y'all's specialty, on both freedom of religion and freedom of speech that we'll kind of suss out together. Let me first read what the First Amendment is, just in case you just moved here from another country and you've never heard of this. Let me just read it because I want to talk a little bit about this. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So in light of that, I want to ask my first question, which is this. Is the United States considered a Christian nation? The only reason I ask that is because there's this clause here that that there's not a respecting an establishment of religion. And so it sounds like what the Constitution is saying is that America officially is agnostic, but yet that doesn't always mean what people think that it means. And so how does this relate to people praying in public schools or putting the 10 Commandments on the courthouse? I'll start with these religious questions and then we'll get into freedom of speech. But what are your thoughts on what that clause does and doesn't mean.
Well, I think the question really gets to an issue that is beyond the First Amendment, which is, were we a Christian nation at our founding? Are we a Christian nation now? Were we a Christian nation in between? Do we have religious freedom more broadly? How does that, do we have an officially established religion? All of those are subsumed inside that very question.
Yeah.
And they all have kind of a technically different answer.
Yeah.
But, let's take the founding era. I think it's unquestionable that our founders were heavily influenced by the Judeo-Christian worldview, many of whom had seminary degrees, many of whom had religious backgrounds, many of whom were pastors themselves. I think of John Witherspoon, the president of Princeton Seminary at the time, signed the Declaration of Independence. This is the guy that was sort of the grandfather of a lot of the American thought, and many of the politicians that would come in the early era of our American history. He was the guy that mentored and trained them. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to argue that they didn't come at least from an appreciation of a religious and Christian worldview in specific. So that era, I think, was very clear. And let's talk about the time that they came out of, right? You're coming out of England. They had all emigrated to the United States or fled England. You go back to the 1620s, and you have the Puritans coming over. You have that profound influence on the early part of our nation. It's really hard to make an argument that there was not a religious influence and a specifically Christian influence within the founding of our country. You could go even deeper into the Constitution itself and the laws of the United States and how they are very distinctly Christian or deriving from biblical principles. And you can talk to friends of mine that would make a great argument about why that would be the case. But when it comes to religious freedom, does it matter whether or not we were actually a Christian nation? And the answer to that is no. In other words, the founding fathers did not intend to create a national church, an established church.
Like you had in England.
Like you had in
Anglicanism,
England.
Yeah.
We did not want an Anglican church. We did not want an Americanized Anglican church, if that was going to be Episcopal or whatever it might be in this era. That was not to be the case. They wanted to have, so they had these influences from religion, most certainly. You can't argue with that, I don't think, fairly. But it also has a lot of Enlightenment ideas. And so I think what the founding fathers did, if we're looking at it carefully and generously, they sort of melded these timeless principles. Hey, this is a truth that works well, that is probably the truth with a capital T, and also Enlightenment thinking, which says, let everybody decide for themselves. And so what they want then is this space to be free for people to make that decision for themselves. So the king doesn't have to say so. George Washington isn't going to be able to tell you what you have to believe or not. They're going to allow you to have that space to decide that for yourself. Now, I think the assumption was probably going to be that most people were going to be Christian, at least in that era and for the foreseeable generational future. But it wasn't mandated for that to be the case. Instead, they wanted to allow that space over the course of the lifetime of this country, now, almost 250 years or more, to be able to have the space for you to chase that. So why do we have this First Amendment? Well, there's a couple of reasons that go into that. Most specifically, they want to give you the space to be able to decide for yourself what capital T truth actually is and pursue that. Right. So if you think your argument of whatever ideological perspective you have, nice plug for the podcast.
Hey, that's our word.
I know.
He used our word.
There's something supposed to fall from the ceiling.
By the way, George Washington can tell me to believe whatever he wants. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that would be great, right?
Yeah.
But if you want to have whatever ideology come out there and make an argument that is the one that ought to be the thing that carries the day and actually even structure our government around, go for it. The First Amendment provides you the space to be able to do that. It also provides the space for me to argue back against that, to say, no, you're wrong. And let me tell you why. And through this give and take, the founding fathers, I think, wanted the country to have that space so that truth would rise like cream to the top and everyone would be able to say, oh, that's the truth. And now I can pursue that. And that I can actually not only order my American civil life to, but I can actually order my steps to eternity with as well.
Yeah.
And so providing that space. So what does the First Amendment do? Well, I mean, look at where it's placed in the Constitution. I'm going to dive into some
get into it as well. Yeah, please.
So not to get too lawyerly on this whole thing, but if
people love lawyers and they love when they get technical. So I think this is the place.
And I'm sure you were reading the Constitution just this morning in preparation,
as I do every morning, as a good American.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the Constitution is structured, I think, fascinatingly. Right? You've got the 7 articles, and they go through the various things that the government is ordained to do. Right? They got the preamble that says, in order to form a more perfect union to ensure domestic tranquility, all these things. Right? We, the people, do hereby ordain and establish this Constitution. It tells you about the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, all the things about how you can lay taxes and raise a navy, and then it sort of stops at the signature line. There's a gap. So now we've taken all the rights that are incumbent upon you and I, because that comes from the Declaration of Independence, which we would call our national philosophy document, right? This is our commentary, if you will, on what a country is supposed to look like and freedom is supposed to be. And that says that all the rights they're endowed to us by our Creator. So these are not government-given rights. These are rights given to us by God at our creation. So what happens? We're now taking those rights and sending them to a centralized form of government in the Constitution because the Articles of Confederation are terrible and they're not going to work out. So now we're forming this Constitution. We're giving some of the rights that I possess as a human being because God gave them to me at my creation, but I can't lay taxes against my neighbor. They call that stealing. Maybe that's a warning. We can't raise a navy, but we have a right to self-defense. And so they're balancing these rights within there as humans. So we're taking some of these rights and saying, you defend us as a nation with our navy, our army, and our things like that. I can't judge against my neighbor writ large. I need a judiciary to do that. I can't establish laws on myself. I can create contracts, but I can't create a joint compact. We need a court to figure that out. We need lawmakers to actually write these laws and help us to ordain a country here.
Yeah.
So we have all these things we're just giving little pieces of ourselves to in the Constitution. Then it stops at the end of the Articles. And then there's this great pause. And all these things that say government can do this, government can do that, courts will do this, the executive will do that, the judiciary will do this. And then all of a sudden it switches around. It says Congress shall make no law.
Yeah.
It's a marked change, right? This is everything that the government is supposed to be doing. Here, do this, do that, do this, do that.
And what they should not do.
And now they don't have any right to do this. Congress shall make no law regarding and all the things that you just went into. And the first one they go to is religious freedom. Now, why would that be the case? Well, again, go back to the Declaration of Independence where we're told that those belong to us. They're given to us by God. And therefore, we have a higher authority that we have to answer to for having received these gifts that is not government. And so we've got to be free to be able to agree with the divine, do all the things that the divine requires of us in order to maintain something that lasts beyond our human earthly existence and into the eternity. And if that's true, then we have to have the space to be able to pursue that, even if some will view that as foolish. That's permissible. We have to have some freedom to be able to pursue what the divine requires of us. And so religious freedom comes in. And to end the point, the rest of the Bill of Rights, which remember, would not have passed, the Constitution would not have been ratified, but for the Bill of Rights. They go down and articulate all the things. So they got the freedom of religion and the speech and all the great things and the freedoms of the First Amendment. You have the Second Amendment, which follows from the First, and boy, good thing those things go together, and they fall in order as well. So make sure we protect one as a readout to the other. I'd like to start the Third Amendment organization at some point where we were talking about quartering of soldiers. That could be a fun little
make
thing.
that the big deal. We're like, guys, this is a big problem in America right now.
Exactly.
A lot of quartering of soldiers.
And then as you go on, the rights sort of broaden out and sort of like say, well, we may have forgotten a few things. They get down to the 10th Amendment, which outside of the First Amendment is my favorite. Because what does that one say? All the rights not expressly articulated herein are reserved to the states and then to the people. Mm-hmm. And they're basically saying, hey, if we forgot anything, we didn't actually mean to give those up.
Yeah. We just meant the states to do them.
You've been through all kind of contracts. You've been through you articulate what the responsibilities and roles are supposed to be in a contract. This is the compact. This is what they're saying. These belong to the people. Mm-hmm. And if we haven't explicitly stated them here in terms of what we've given to government, mm-hmm. we retain them. We did not give them over.
Yeah.
And so now that changes the whole dynamic of how we view government, doesn't it?
Sure.
Government is not something that is imposed upon us. It is something that we've agreed to. It is not something that they are so smart that they come up with these great laws that are meant to do us good. They now work for us. We retain our freedoms. We give a little bit back to them because we have to form that central form of government to be a more domestic tranquility and all those things. Mm-hmm. But they're not given full reign over our lives like the king had been in England or dictators had been in other countries. And so for the first time in human history, we have now this democratic republic that says these are rights endowed by their creator. They belong to the individual. We're lending a few of these things to the centralized form of government because we need to have a government.
I love it.
But you retain all the rights that you did not explicitly give over to the government. That includes, at the foremost, religious liberty.
I love it. That's a great answer. By the way, in case you don't know, Jeremy's family crest, it's just a picture of Teddy Roosevelt holding an AR-15 riding on an eagle. And so a lot of constitutional
stuff. I've got to draw that up. That'd be great.
Yeah. It's going to say, never mind.
I'm not one for tattoos, but that one might be one I would get.
Yeah, you should. You should. And you could play off the word dice and die and freedom and all that.
Right.
Okay, let me ask you another one. When it comes to, because we're going to do freedom of religion, then freedom of speech. When it comes to freedom of religion, what are the limits on that? Meaning, drug use. What if your religion wants you to use drugs to encounter the divine, something like that? Things that the government would say is illegal. Human sacrifice, attending a church during a pandemic. I don't know where I get that one. Those kind of things. Drinking communion wine during Prohibition, which there was an allowance for. As soon as you say, we're going to have the government and we're going to have laws, and these laws keep people in line, but you have freedom of religion. What do you do with religions that hold, because this was a thing also in the UK with carrying daggers for certain religions and these kind of things where you're not allowed to have, knives in the UK. It's not America. Only the bad guys stab you with the knives. You don't get to have one. And so what are your thoughts on where are the limits to freedom of religion when it comes to things that are illegal?
One of the greatest religious liberty cases, it's also one of the funniest names of cases, is the Church of Lukumi Babluai versus the city of Hialeah, county of Hialeah. And
I'm assuming this is in Ohio. I'm kidding. This is
in
Hawaii?
Florida, actually.
And
the Church of Lukumi Babluai is a church that practiced the ritual sacrifice of chickens, as a matter of fact. And they would, if you remember the movie Major League and Jobu, it kind of modeled after that.
Okay.
That's kind of where this has come from.
We do something similar, but it's Thanksgiving. Sorry, with turkey.
So they have this practice, but the city of Hialeah is like, hey, look, we're not going to allow you to like kill animals in our backyard. And they put up this ordinance. Well, this is a generalized ordinance, so you couldn't slaughter your dog or your cow or whatever because this is a city and we want to be somewhat civilized. This is not farm life. We don't want to have these. But it had an impact upon the sincere religious belief of the Church of Lukumi Babluai. And what do we do with this? So we don't normally have people slaughtering things, and we can have sort of rules that say make sure you do it cleanly and all these things. Those are fine. Well, the government is then presented with a question: Can I force someone to violate the religious conscience in order to meet this law that is sort of generally applicable to everybody else? And the courts would answer the question by saying no. You have to go through at least a step of argument to make sure that we are respecting the sincere religious expression of these individuals, and that you're inhibiting that religion, you're preventing that free exercise, that guarantee of the free exercise of religion, you're inhibiting that by or substantially burdening it in an absolutely necessary way and the least way possible. Meaning, if you have any other way to accomplish that governmental objective of making sure that disease doesn't spread by blood flowing down the street or whatever it might be, that you have pursued all those other avenues, and there's no other way to accomplish this but with this ordinance. And the court there said that you couldn't accomplish that. And on top of that, the city of Hialeah clearly had been engaged in some discriminatory behavior and had passed that law specifically for that issue. But the general principle remains, and this is how we now evaluate all of our cases, including during COVID. Now, we understand that worldwide pandemic is a bad thing, that sickness is a bad thing, and we certainly want to be respectful of these health and safety ordinances. But general claims to health and safety are not sufficient. The government has to respect that First Amendment right, that you have the right to be wrong. You have the right to practice a crazy religion. Because what is crazy to one person in religion is absolute dogma to someone else.
Yeah, you got to define it. You got to keep it for everybody so that your stuff that doesn't feel crazy to you is also protected. Hashtag I stand with blah, 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 do I.
Yeah. Look, I've defended many people that I theologically disagree with, very much so. Now, I come from a Protestant tradition, but I've defended Catholics and Orthodox Jews. I've defended Native Americans. We've defended the Falun Gong here. I mean, we've done all kinds of Muslim cases, jail cases, Buddhist cases. Well, why do we do all these cases when I personally believe that many of those religions are not the truth, that my religion is actually the truth? That's the truth claim I come with. Why would I dare defend the? Well, when you defend one faith group, you defend them all. That is the rising tide of that kind of freedom, not to be trite with that kind of a phrase, but it's true. When one faith group is protected, when the rights of my Orthodox rabbi down the street is able to be defended, and he's able to meet in his home for religious worship without the city coming around and saying, you can't do that, and you don't have enough, you have too many cars here. My favorite is when they told an Orthodox synagogue that needed to have more parking available to them. They don't drive on the Sabbath. It was hilarious to me. But you if you're free to be able to have an Orthodox Jewish group meeting in their home, then you're able to have a Baptist Bible study meeting in their home as well. And you can go just down the line of all these things. So the more freedom we preserve for everybody to pursue their right to be wrong, the more it is you have freedom to be right as well.
I love it. If you this one is not as serious. If you could fight any former U.S. president before 1990, that way it doesn't get too contemporary, who would it be and why? Because this is a game that I often play. If you could go back in history and fight somebody, who would it be? I always say, somebody like Mother Teresa, just to offend them, and I let them know I wouldn't really do that. It would be Jean-Jacques Rousseau who I would fight. Which president do you like the least in history, and why?
Well, if I had to fight someone just to win, it'd be James K. Polk, because he only lasted a couple days, and I suppose he was sick during the whole time, so maybe I could get a win in there. I would not want to go up against Andrew Jackson. I mean,
Yes.
he'd be fun to fight in the sense that he'd be a worthy sparring partner for certain, but I think I'd come on the losing end of that just physically. General Grant, President Grant, would be an interesting one just from I'd have to know how much he had to drink before the fight. Just that would maybe even the odds a little bit more for me, perhaps.
Or maybe Taft. Taft, you just kind of judo, kind of use his own body.
You'd just be able to run
him.
faster around him and be able to outlast probably at the end of the day. No, I mean, if we're talking physical fights, those are all the fun experiments to go through. If we're talking ideological fights, my favorite one would be to fight, and I think I'd do a service to the country, would be Woodrow Wilson.
Okay.
Woodrow Wilson does away with the direct election of the senators, which is a travesty when our constitutional form of government. Also institutes the first income tax in our country, and it has been socialist downhill ever since. And so I think it would be a fun experience to go and at least intellectually debate President Wilson.
Love it. Love it. Okay. What if someone claims, I think this is very relevant. What if someone claims that your religion imposes on their quote unquote freedoms? I'll give you an example. Does a Christian baker have to make a wedding cake for a gay wedding? Again, not for a gay person that just happens to be about some other event in their life, but for a gay wedding. Or a Jewish baker have to make a cake for a pro-Nazi celebration? What happens when, because it sometimes seems like one protected group's rights will bump up against another protected group's rights. How does that work with the First Amendment? I know you guys have had to deal with some of that with bakers and that kind of stuff. How does that work with the First Amendment? What should people think about that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've never felt the need to have to resolve what the First Amendment doesn't resolve for us. The First Amendment says, hey, you're allowed to be free, and you're allowed to talk, and you're allowed to say more. And so we ought to allow that freedom to everybody. So the solution, the cake baker, for instance, which we have a case very similar to Jack Phillips, the Klein's case, a very similar situation. The solution there is not actually protecting one ideology over another. That's actually the false dichotomy that I think has been foisted upon us. That's not true. The solution there is to say, wait a minute, there is a core value that's present here, and we ought to protect that right to have him make the cake or whatever it might be. But if you don't like it, you are free to tell everybody and everybody that you don't like it.
Yeah.
And that's the freedom that we ought to possess. That's the balancing act that the First Amendment provides to us. We had a case a couple of years ago called Kennedy versus Bremerton High School School District, and that was the football coach that took a knee in prayer and all that. And the great line that comes out of that was to say, we've got the free speech clause, the establishment clause, the free exercise clause. They're sometimes used independently of each other to sort of war against each other.
That's right. And the reason I pitch it that way is because they always make it like you're taking away someone's right to have a cake or something like that,
right,
which is not the same as somebody's right to not go against their conscience in a religion. And so they always put it as a false dichotomy. But what you're saying is we've got to parse it out and realize, wait a second, that's not the case.
Well, that's what the court says, that these are not warring rights. These are complementary ones. They're meant to complement one another. And so if you don't like someone's religion, the free speech clause protects your right to tell them you don't like it.
Yeah.
If you don't like someone's speech, the free exercise clause tells you don't have to believe it. The establishment clause is supposed to say, government, you can't get involved in this whole mess. And so you can't use the establishment clause as a cudgel to shut people's religious beliefs off. You have to allow them to go forward and actually engage in their speech or their beliefs and their exercise and that sort of thing. So again, that line from Kennedy is saying, hey, look, these are all, and the paragraph that I'm thinking about says, they're a part of the same amendment, guys. I'm paraphrasing, but only slightly by the justices. This is they're two sides of one coin when it comes to the establishment clause and the free exercise clause. They're meant to complement each other and to doubly protect religious liberty, protect it from imposition by the government from the establishment clause perspective, and protect it from the outworking of the government to suppress your religious liberty in the free exercise clause. These are meant to complement each other to maximize religious freedom, and more broadly throughout the rest of the amendment, maximize speech and freedom. Our goal here is to create more freedom and not less, but hey guys, you're using it to create less freedom and not more. And so don't utilize the government in a way that would shut down freedom. If you don't like something in private industry or private practice or whatever it might be, feel free to criticize it. You can create your own blog, your own website. You can create a new podcast. You can stand with a bullhorn in the street and yell at these people. But you can't bring in the entire weight of the government that comes with overwhelming penalties and The government has a military, the point of a gun, all these things that would jail time. You can't use that in a way to shut down a worldview that you don't like. You don't like speech? Fine. A lot of us don't. Use more and better speech to counter it instead.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, and I've got a lesson coming out on John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, and that's kind of the idea, which is if you want to refute a bad idea, do it with a better idea, not by shutting down, silencing your opponent, either through governmental action or just through social pressure. Let everyone speak. Let everyone do their thing. So I think that's super helpful. So let me ask this, because you mentioned this a second ago. When it comes to holding your religion or religious views with sincere belief, that's one of the things that really matters. What counts as sincere belief? I realize that that means that you don't have to belong to an official sect or denomination or even an official religion as of today. You can start your own if you want to. What is sincere belief? Because if I say, hey, I've got a sincere belief that I never want to pay taxes again, it's going to be tough. And so what does sincere belief mean? What does it not mean? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the courts have been interestingly silent when it comes to sincere religious beliefs. In other words, if you advance that it is a sincere religious belief, it probably is. Now, there's some language that will help define that to some degree because we're lawyers, we got to write things, and it helps. But the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, which I don't like to quote very often here, but they wear a strainer on their head, and they claim to have the right to engage in the worship of the great meatball monster or something. I don't remember what it all is.
As we all do,
right? I mean, they're to you and I and many others, I'm sure they're very odd. Are they sincere? That's up to them and the spaghetti meatball, whoever their deity is. I don't know what it is. Look, I am willing to say if you believe something crazy, have at it. You want to believe in something crazy? Believe in something crazy. It doesn't bother me whatsoever. But let's put a little bit more of a philosophical strain on this. Dr. Robert George from Princeton has written a great article some years ago where he goes back to James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance. It's a great work on religious liberty. And that's where he goes into, James Madison does, and Robbie George pulls out, saying that what we here consider just a duty to mankind is oftentimes a duty to the divine. And at that time, it was James Madison passing by the Virginia Baptists who were jailed by the state of the colony of Virginia at the time for their engaging in the Baptist beliefs in violation of the official Church of England or official Church of Virginia at the time. And that was wrong, he said. No. You can't limit someone. They have a duty, this vertical duty to the divine that we have to protect. Now, you may think it's crazy, but you have the right to be wrong. You have the right to be crazy in that respect and worship the divine. So it is sincere, sort of assumedly sincere, because we say, I believe it, it must be so. We're going to give you the space to do that. Now, we've got parameters around that. We've talked a little bit about that already with the chicken case out of Florida. But it is something for us to say, it's not for the government to define what your religious beliefs are. It is for you as an individual to define that.
So the burden of proof is on them if they're saying that this is not sincere, not on you to prove that it's sincere.
But that bar is extremely low. Yeah. And that's why in COVID, for instance, we had a real hard time with a lot of governmental actors around the country imposing a different religious belief upon people. No, our religious beliefs require us to meet in person. Well, that ran up against government dictates very quickly. Well, it's a sincere belief to have to meet in person. Well, I don't think so, says Gavin Newsom or the governor of Illinois, whose name escapes me at the moment, and others that have said, no, you don't have to worship. The Governor Cuomo or Mayor Cuomo, Governor Cuomo in New York say, no, you can't. Churches are shut down. That you can't do that. These are sincere religious beliefs that people have. They have to meet together. And in that case, you can actually point to Scripture, and it kind of helps buttress that thought. But the Supreme Court comes in later on and says, yeah, we're going to assume that these are sincere religious beliefs. Now deal with them. Yeah. So if they come to you and say these are sincere, then you have to deal with the sincerity of that belief and go through the steps that restrain government from imposing upon the free exercise of religion.
Got it. Okay, one more question on freedom of religion, and then I want to pivot to freedom of speech if we can, because that one's obviously a big one on the First Amendment. How does freedom of religion work with kids? So I mentioned a case, Wisconsin versus Yoder, 1972. The Supreme Court ruled that the Amish didn't have to send their kids to public school. How does that work? What happens if there's some parents who, let's say, are Satan worshipers or flying spaghetti monster worshipers or whatever, and they're raising their kids in a way that is, they're not getting a good education. They're teaching them to be terrible people, to be racist, to try to hurt people, whatever it is. At what point does the government get to step in or not step in when it comes to those that are underage with freedom of religion?
Yeah, Yoder is a great case, and it gets to that's actually the genesis of the strict scrutiny test that I was talking about earlier. So what it did there is to say, does the state, I think it was Ohio, or maybe it was Pennsylvania, somewhere in that area, is saying that you have to send kids to school. Public education is compulsory. You must send your children to school. And the Amish are saying, no, maybe you haven't understood us for 500 years. We don't do that kind of thing. And the state imposed it upon them. They required these little Amish kids to go to the public schools or to some school somewhere. And so what was born out of that case was it's called a strict scrutiny standard, meaning, okay, you believe that you have a compelling reason to have people educated. Mm-hmm. All right, that's fine. Good. You have a compulsory education program. We believe that's a compelling justification to impose upon the free exercise of religion of the Amish. Great. Now you have substantially burdened the religious beliefs of the Amish because they believe they should not have any participation with you. So you have to now prove not only do you have that compelling reason, but that you have advanced that compelling justification by the least restrictive means possible. And not a lesser restrictive means. The least restrictive means possible. And there the state could not overcome that hurdle.
Yeah.
And so that's what applies now to all these other circumstances as well. Okay, so child sacrifice or whatever you have. Do we have a compelling justification in making sure that our children are safe? We absolutely do. And there is no less restrictive means than to prevent someone from engaging in the slaughter of another human being. And so there's no other way to prevent that than to say you can't do that.
Totally.
There's no lesser restrictive means. And so the process works itself out beautifully.
Got it.
And that's something that we argue for all the time. That, look, we understand that there are laws that are going to rub up against religion all the time. Mm-hmm. The assumption is going to be that if you substantially burden the free exercise of religion, the city now has to come back, or the governmental actor has to come back and prove that they are engaged in a compelling justification, the compelling reason for why they've had to substantially burden the free exercise of religion. And then they've got to walk through that whole process. By the way, this is just a little helpful and free piece too.
Please, I'm mainly here for free legal advice, so I don't have to pay you. I can just learn it here and represent myself pro se.
Yoder would be reaffirmed, so that would be actually overruled by a case called Employment Division versus Smith, which involves the smoking of peyote and another fun little kind of tangential thing that's seemingly illegal but also protected, but not. Congress would then pass a law in the 1990s called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And where do they turn for the language in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or what we call RFRA? They turn back to Yoder, and they grab that language out of there. They ensconce it in federal law. Mm-hmm. In many, many states, I think now 35 or 37 states have adopted a state-level RFRA that is then expanded to something called RLUPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, that extends those rights not only to municipalities when they're trying to engage in zoning restrictions that impact churches and synagogues and whatnot, but also to prisoners within jail, which I find fascinating.
Yeah,
you lose your rights to freedom by going to jail, but we're still going to respect your human freedom to be able to pursue the divine. I think it's just fascinating. There's a great case called Hort versus Hobbs during argument. There's a beard restriction. I find this to be relatable right now.
We need a whole episode just on this.
Right? Hort versus Hobbs is the state of Alabama says Muslim men cannot, or any men cannot have a beard longer than, I think it was a quarter of an inch. You could have a quarter of an inch beard. And there were Muslim men at this time saying, I need a beard that's at least a half an inch. And the state of Alabama said, no, we're not going to allow you to do that. And at oral argument, I kid you not, at oral argument at the Supreme Court of the United States, Justice Alito, the whole argument had been from the state that there might be contraband hidden in the half-inch beard, and therefore we have to have a quarter-inch beard. You'd be in a lot of trouble if you were in prison for many reasons in Alabama, but especially for the beard side of things.
So many reasons.
But if the Justice Alito in response to this says, has anybody thought of simply running a comb through the beard to determine whether a revolver falls out? And in that moment, you could sort of see the advocate for the state to sort of sigh and say, I've lost my case.
Yeah.
And it reaffirms that principle that even in the prison context, it seems like a general law that should be applicable to everybody, but it could rub up against religion.
Yeah.
You still have to go through the process and make sure that you are not violating the free exercise of religion beyond what is absolutely and 100% necessary.
Gosh, I wish they had explicitly put beards in the First Amendment. I think that would have just been easier for all of us. But I'll see if I can I can lobby for that. I'm big on Big Beard is a lobby group. All right, I want to turn quickly to freedom of speech. So thank you so much. That's super helpful with freedom of religion. I know that what you guys do obviously involves that, but that bleeds into freedom of speech, which is also in the First Amendment. So turning to freedom of speech, what does the freedom of speech clause allow? And what are the limits of what you can say and how you say it? Because from my understanding, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm a learned man of letters, but I'm not a First Amendment attorney. The First Amendment is there to protect the content of what you say. But there are things about where you can say it, certain private property and that kind of stuff. What you're saying, is it content or is it yelling bomb on an airplane? Is it saying, let's riot outside the courthouse, that kind of stuff? What are the limits to freedom of speech? Go.
Well, it shouldn't surprise you that the limits to the freedom of speech are largely the same as applied to for exercise of religion. Well, why would that be? Well, I already told you that those clauses, individual clauses of the First Amendment, are meant to be complementary. They're not supposed to be warring against each other.
Yeah.
And so the language of the First Amendment is supposed to be adjudicated in the same way, whether it's the free speech clause or the free exercise clause. Now, those have diverged a little bit over time. They've come back together here recently, and in the last maybe a decade or so, where free exercise of religion was really suffering. The free speech clause was great. You could get a much better ruling if your case was a speech case rather than an exercise case. Those have come much more back to parity thanks to Coach Kennedy and his case. And so there are there restrictions on speech? Well, certainly the same way that there are restrictions on religious liberty. Okay, these are all still core civil rights enshrined in our Constitution. How do we deal with them? The same way we would have dealt with it with religion. Okay, you have to engage in the free exercise or the free speech here. Well, fine. Does government have an answer to that? And now we're going to get into form analysis and things like that are wildly boring that I won't bore anybody here with. Then you can really complicate things by saying, well, what happens when the government speaks? Mm-hmm. Can the government speak, and can they say certain things and value certain worldviews and ideologies over others?
There's the answer is again.
I know it's free endorsements here.
Genius.
But the answer to that is actually yes, and they can actually speak on behalf of the government. They can actually speak on behalf of religion as well. They can convey a religious message. Things like 10 Commandments, or the was it 7 aphorisms of Summum? I think it was Pleasant Grove versus Summum is the case I'm thinking of. That is a fascinating case. It's this obelisk with the 7 aphorisms or 8 aphorisms of Summum. It donated, and they didn't really want to put it out there. But they did have a 10 Commandments monument. So we've chosen this speech and not that speech. We've accepted this. We decided to speak this way. That's okay, the government says. And we can keep on going on. But the general rule is the same. We're supposed to have more speech rather than less. When government censors speech, it goes too far. When it directs a viewpoint, it has gone way too far. And when it says that that you engage in, there's certain content you can't publish or speak upon, then it's really getting into a bad spot. It's a subset of viewpoint discrimination, which the Supreme Court in Rosenberger versus Rector, I believe, said is one of the most egregious forms of content discrimination. So these are fascinating cases that all bleed up against one another. Again, designed to be complementary and not warring.
Okay. There's also a weird thing when it comes to what is not protected. I've heard some story of when it comes to pornography that the Supreme Court had to decide what was considered freedom of speech versus what is too obscene. Does this just mean they're just sitting there watching a bunch of it trying to figure it out and then they come down with an answer? Or I'm not trying to be too crass, but I read that somewhere and I thought, that is fast. That's probably why they wear those big robes. What is going on with that?
That was actually a quote by one of the justices, and I'm blanking on which one it was now. It's going to bother me after this discussion. But his quote was, "Well, I don't know what pornography is, but I'll know it when I see it."
Yes.
And so it's a fascinating thing where, especially when it comes to obscenity, it's a localized standard. So it's the values of the community, which I think go back to our first discussion about Christian nation or not.
Yeah, what's allowed in Vegas is going to be very different than what's allowed in West Virginia.
Certainly, but has that changed much?
Yeah.
And I think it's now, especially now, it is coarsened quite heavily from the time of the founding. And so what would have been allowed in 1789 is far different than what might be allowed in 1989 and certainly 2024. But, one thing I like to point out, and this is especially when we have cities that are trying to say you can't have a church inside this zoning district of a town. I love to go back to the table of uses of a town's zoning ordinances, because oftentimes they'll have adult-themed businesses or naked dance clubs of some sort. Well, the Supreme Court has declared that nude dancing is speech, and it is therefore entitled to protection under the First Amendment. Well, I love to point that out and say, well, if nude dancing is protected, then certainly we would think that a church would be protected as well. And if you're allowing town to have adult-themed businesses inside of your zoning district, but you're saying that churches cannot come in there, where have you put your values?
Yeah. It's good. Okay, this one is interesting in light of everything that happened really post-2020 with people getting canceled, censored, etc. when it comes to freedom of speech. Because what we're typically talking about is that the government cannot restrict it, but certain private entities can, depending on what those are. Here's my question. In an age when the de facto town square is now the internet, right? We don't have just a town square where you can come and give a speech like they used to in, the 1700s or whatever. Is being canceled or deplatformed an infringement on someone's First Amendment rights? Is social media becoming a type of utility, almost like electricity or water or internet, which you can't cut off because of someone's political views? Is there a sense in which, because what people wanted to say is if Facebook cancels you or Twitter cancels you or Amazon won't sell your book or whatever, some would say, well, you're taking away my freedom of speech. Others say, well, no, that's for the government. That's a private entity. But then the question is, well, if this has become the de facto town square, this is how people communicate now through the internet. Is there a sense in which your freedom of speech is being infringed upon? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there was a case in this last term of the Supreme Court of the United States in the 2023-2024 term, the October 23 term of the Supreme Court, that dealt a lot with this. And it left a very unsatisfying answer because they really didn't deal with it sufficiently. I've actually testified in at least one state legislature on this matter. I think I actually provided written testimony in another. And then we filed some amicus briefs in support of a Florida law and also a Texas law regarding social media regulations. Mm-hmm. I think you're right to say, and by the way, the short answer up front here is to say, I'm not sure where this is going to go.
Okay.
And I really don't. But it's fascinating to think ourselves through this right now, because I agree with you that I think the social media universe, the internet, is becoming the new town square. So what do we do with that? Mm-hmm. Do we just port over all the language we have about the literal town square into that? Well, the complication there is that this town square is not public, as the public park might be.
Right.
The Facebook is a private entity. What do we do with that?
Yeah, well, and private entities, real quick, private entities still have to protect certain rights, meaning
right.
Facebook cannot take down somebody's post because they're black. But they can take down somebody's post because it expresses a Christian worldview, or it expresses a Buddhist worldview, or it expresses a conservative worldview, or something like that. At what point are they being inconsistent with maybe the way they enforce it?
Well, I would disagree that they cannot. They should not.
Sorry. Yeah, that's what I mean.
And that they have, right?
Right?
In other words, it would be horrible public. It would be a terrible public relations nightmare for them to take down something based upon race or gender or something like that. But it is almost de rigueur for them to take something down because of religion, right? It's acceptable because the community says it's now acceptable.
Right.
I disagree with that, but that's kind of where we stand here. And so the solution there really is, okay, are we going to, it's not a legal answer, it's a political answer. Are you going to allow that? Now you can also vote with your feet. I don't like how Facebook treats me like this. I'm shutting it down. You can't advertise to me anymore. I'm cutting out your business. That's one solution. The argument right now, and especially after the Twitter files of vintage 2022, I think 23, where you have the government influencing what the regulators at Facebook and Twitter and all the other social media platforms are doing. Mm-hmm. That's where I think the Supreme Court left open an answer that they should have given to us. I think they didn't, and it became more obvious, I think, after. In fact, Zuckerberg, I think, put out a letter after the Supreme Court made its decision, basically saying, yeah, we did that and we're never going to do that ever again. Mm-hmm. So that's a weird circumstance. I don't like that. I think there's a universe in which number one, there is a legal principle that where the government attempts to do through a private actor what it cannot do as a state actor, that is itself illegal.
Yeah.
And that was really the question before the court that they really sort of worked around with a procedural thing. So I wonder what the case would have been if Zuckerberg's letter had come out before the argument or during the litigation below or something like that. And it may change in the future because of all this. But even that letter, I think, is a sign of hope for us, which means that the private industry is recognizing there is a high value for employing First Amendment values in the private context. Mm-hmm. And I've said this before in written and as well as other interviews, saying that the First Amendment has worked really well for us. Mm-hmm. Let's just adopt that standard in the private context.
Right.
So Facebook, you ought to allow more speech than less. Elon Musk, I don't think it was because of me. Maybe it was because of me. Who knows?
Yeah. Let's just go ahead and say yeah.
It probably was.
Yeah, for the case of this, that's a fact. Keep going. Yeah.
So he goes out and rallies up $45 billion and buys Twitter, now X, and is like, y'all have at it. This is now the free speech platform.
Yeah.
Why? Well, Twitter's an international organization. They could have adopted any state's thought on that. But they said, you know what works well? This First Amendment thing. Let's use that instead. So I think at the end of the day, the market's going to control the private industry on that. There are some little peculiarities that'll come out with that. We have the whole Section 230 debate that's going on as well at Congress. I think there's good discussion to be had there. And I think social media is largely very scared of what that discussion would be to become very heavily regulated on that. But it's probably a solution for the private industry, private market to solve on its own based upon the needs of the market that is being known to them.
Yeah. But it seems like even that's a great answer. It seems though, even with private entities, okay, so let's say I own a restaurant and I don't allow people to eat there because of their race. The government would say you can't do that, even though it's private. Or I say you cannot eat at my restaurant because of your religion. The government would say, no, you cannot do that. So even though it's a private entity, there are certain things that you still can't do. People's rights trump your private entity, if that makes sense. But it seems like on social media platforms and on the internet, for some reason, they can distinguish. I won't cancel the Muslim who says that they're against LGBTQ issues because we don't want to be Islamophobic. But I can cancel the Christian's view when it comes to homosexuality because that goes against our terms of service or something. So I guess in my mind, there seems to be an inequality in how those terms of service are applied.
Well, there absolutely is. Look, we represented the Babylon Bee on an amicus brief before the Supreme Court on that matter itself. And that was basically the argument that we were trying to make as well, to say, look, social media has been given the freedom to pick and choose which speech they want to put up there. And it's gotten out of hand, essentially. And so let us give you all the examples of where the Onion or the other speech that the left likes, and they're allowed to go free reign. But when it comes to people that have one joke and only one joke, the Babylon Bee, that's an inside joke if you don't know. But if they don't get to make the joke online. The Onion, no problem. The Babylon Bee, you have a problem. It's open and obvious. Now, I think that has again largely solved itself. And if I remember from the podcast where Seth Dillon interviews Elon Musk, it was the motivating reason for why he bought Twitter. So the market actually did solve itself. And the first people that they turned back on to Twitter was the Babylon Bee. So I think the market has itself recalibrated, at least where it comes to X. And there are probably things that need to be more adjusted even there. Yeah. But it is sort of kind of fixing itself. Yeah. Nature returns to itself somehow.
Yeah, and if you've not seen the clip of the Babylon Bee guys with their interview with Elon Musk, they basically slide him a napkin. They're like, we have a gift for you. And they slide him a napkin, and on it just says, I owe you $44 billion. It's hilarious. Okay, fantastic. So let me ask this question. What are some dangers that you're seeing on the First Amendment issue? Meaning, is the First Amendment being eroded? Is it hate speech to tell a homosexual that you believe their lifestyle is wrong or that you think that Islam's not always peaceful, or vice versa? Because again, this podcast will interview both sides. If somebody just wants to say the Bible is a book full of lies, they have freedom to do that. Is the First Amendment, though, being eroded? You've seen several universities and several law schools that have pushed for more restraints, even some people calling for getting rid of the First Amendment. Thoughts on that? Are we less free, more free than we used to be? Are we seeing people attack it?
We will always be less free. The First Amendment will be more eroded the more we allow it to be unchallenged, government action to be unchallenged. So if we're just simply going to allow, well, it's no big deal, I'll just, Coach Kennedy's a great example. I don't have to pray on the 50-yard line.
We explained just to the listeners real quick, just briefly that case. Yeah. This doesn't have to be long, but
Coach Kennedy was a football coach in a high school in Washington, had a commitment that he would take a knee in silent prayer for 30 seconds on the 50-yard line after every game. Go out there, 15 seconds, kneel, pray, done, go. They fired him for it. He won at the Supreme Court saying he's got the right to be able to do that. So Coach Kennedy very easily could have said, I don't have to pray on the 50-yard line. I can pray in the end zone, on the eye of the field, in the press box. They offered him to go back into the school, into the janitor's closet, to do it over there if he wanted to. He could have barely said, you know what, no problem, no big deal. Well, the death of freedom doesn't come all the time by the invasion of a foreign force or at the blunt end of a gun. It comes through one small decision to censor yourself.
Death by 1,000 cuts.
Death by 1,000 cuts. And so it could have been Coach Kennedy saying, no problem. Well, a little bit of freedom dies that day. How about I had a client one time, 6-year-old girl, who was at lunchtime and wanted to pray over her chicken nuggets and mac and cheese. 6 years old.
You know who would approve of that is that church of Budabadibadue with the chickens.
Yeah, right.
Sorry, keep going. Okay.
Maybe where they source the meat. I don't know. But the teacher said, no, you can't do that. And she says, but it's good to pray. And no, you can't pray. Well, the parents could have just walked away from that whole thing and said, we don't want to have the trouble. Instead, Fox News picks it all up and they have a lot of big to do about the whole thing. But a little bit of freedom would have died that day. How about the pastor I'm representing right now who has a church that's open 24 hours a day? And the church the town is saying you can't have this church open 24 hours a day. You've got to do this, that, and the other thing that we don't require of anybody else but this church. And oh, by the way, now you have criminal charges to have to answer to. You said, I don't want to do that. Well, government grows a little bit bigger that day and freedom gets a little bit smaller. How about the synagogue out in Long Island that the town wanted to take through eminent domain? We'll go somewhere else. We don't need this building. Well, government expands, freedom contracts. We go on and down the line. Rabbis in Beverly Hills that are trying to have meetings at their home. Neighbors are putting nails in front of tires for people that park there to go to prayer meetings. Drones hovering over their meetings by the government to spy on them and to find out what they're doing. They could have just said, no, we don't want to deal with that. This is too much. Nobody would have thought twice about that at all. But freedom would have died a little bit more. So all that is needed for us to lose our freedom is to absolutely do nothing. Now, it doesn't take a whole lot for us to preserve our freedom, by the way.
It's people being willing to have a small amount of persecution. Maybe that's getting fired, hiring you guys. Maybe it's whatever to keep it alive. But it's I don't want anything bad to happen unto me. I don't want anybody to get mad. I just want to kind of keep it to myself. You're saying that's really how it dies.
Yeah. Well, you don't know how it lives, though. And Ronald Reagan is to thank for this, right? He said that freedom is not something that passes down through the bloodstream. It's something that we have to commit ourselves to every generation, lest we wake up one day and talk about the America that used to be. Yeah. Well, then how do we do that? Well, it's up to you and I, right? You and I, and this is so super simple. Sit down, have dinner with your kids, and tell them about what freedom means. I like to say, look, I've been to the Supreme Court. I've got all the attaboys on the wall. I've done a lot of cool cases. I've talked to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. I've done it all, right? I've talked to Zach Lee now. I mean,
this is the height of your career. I expect to see this on your resume. Yeah,
right.
This is it.
My sisters have done more for the cause of freedom than I will ever do in my entire career. Why? My wife too. Why? Because they've sat down every night. They've homeschooled their kids. They've told them about what freedom means. They've explained to them the cost of losing that freedom and what that means so that the next generation will know this is freedom. Mm-hmm. Not some imitation that we're being told that is actually big government in disguise. No, this is freedom. This is what our future is supposed to be. This is what George Washington said and John Adams said and James Madison said. This is what the founding of our country is intended to believe. You go and believe that. And when your kids get big, you go teach them the same thing. So you want to save America, you want to preserve freedom, have dinner with your kids tonight.
That's great. Let me give you the last question here, just because we're coming up on time. What word would you give to the American people regarding the First Amendment that they might not know? Any final thoughts where if you have to just say, hey, this is something you might not know about this, some other take-homes, which you just gave a fantastic one, anything that you want to say to the listeners to just say, listen, at the end of the day, here's the deal, here's what you need to know.
Yeah, at the risk of belaboring Coach Kennedy's case, it comes from that case. It is this, that there was a case that we overturned in that case. There was a bad precedent from the year after I was born. And so for 45 years, this had been the law of the land. And anytime religion kind of trotted out in the public square, it lost because of this Lemon case that was decided in 1979. And so you have this terrible law that gets overruled, and we're all so excited about it. We're happy about it. We celebrate it. We name a conference room after the case, right? It's a great case. The little red check mark is on that case now. You can't cite it in any other cases. It's kind of dead. Coach Kennedy's case is free and good. But it means absolutely nothing if you don't go out and live like someone who's free. You have more freedom today than you've had in your entire lifetime. But it means absolutely nothing if we will not go out there and live like a free people. When the government says, no, you guys can't come and worship here because, you'd have to be 6 feet apart and wear a mask and all these things, and you say, oh, I guess that's true, and don't even challenge it, well, freedom dies a little bit that day. Coach Kennedy took a knee and stood up for our religious freedom that way. What does it take for us? It doesn't take that much of an effort. You have more freedom today than you've had in your entire lifetime. Go live like a free person.
Fantastic. Really good, dude. I appreciate that. If all the members of the Supreme Court fell into the ocean and you only had 8 lifesavers, who do you not throw into? I'm kidding. Don't answer that. Jeremy, thank you for being on the show. Thank you for being on Ideological. Really, really helpful. Thank you for your wisdom and your expertise. I appreciate you being on.
My pleasure, with the exception of that last question.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, he doesn't agree with that. By the way, that is something you can get mad at me for. He would not ever say that because he's a gentleman. We love all the Supreme Court justices.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, man.